Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story, the U.S. taking aim at Beijing's gruesome practice of harvesting organs and selling them for profit. The House passed a bill Tuesday to protect the main faith group victimized by the crime, Falun Gong. A daughter rising up from the pain of losing her father and working to expose an unprecedented modern-day persecution. More about her story and mission and why she joined Shen Yun Performing Arts. Will the U.S. defend the Philippines if someone dies in a clash with China? A top State Department diplomat gives his answer.
I do think it's important to say, Mike, that the Philippines are very cautious at this juncture.
And soon Americans will hear from President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump about what solutions they have at hand for the Russia-Ukraine war. That's as they prepare to take the debate stage this week. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A bill to fight chilling crimes happening inside China passed the House Tuesday. It looks to crack down on forced organ harvesting. That is, harvesting organs from victims without their consent and while they're still alive.
The Falun Gong Protection Act would require the U.S. to sanction any individual involved in or facilitating the Chinese regime's forced organ harvesting of its own people. Now, this means visas revoked and property transactions in the U.S. also revoked. It would also require the U.S. to form a policy to avoid cooperation with China in the organ transplant field. Now, this bill passed the House on a voice vote. It was led by Congressman Scott Perry. It's a bipartisan bill. Here are his comments on the House floor.
This bill is the first binding commitment by Congress to take strong legal action against the persecution and forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong, making Falun Gong the centerpiece of legislation, an action long overdue after 25 years.
Two, we are sending a clear message that the United States will sanction those who knowingly and directly engaged in or facilitated the involuntary harvesting of organs within the People's Republic of China. This legislation sheds light on and condemns this horrific practice and holds to account those responsible.
Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, is a spiritual practice based on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. And in China in 1999, the practice grew to have 100 million followers. That's when the Chinese regime launched its brutal persecution of the practice, imprisoning, torturing, and killing these practitioners for their organs. And this persecution still goes on today. I also spoke with Congressman Ralph Norman about the persecution of these Falun Gong practitioners and the continued human rights abuses that still go on committed by the Chinese regime.
This is a tragedy of what our youth are facing with the drugs, but with the organ harvesting, it's intolerable. Well, freedom is not free. We're realizing that now. We've got to fight for it, and just as the Chinese people are good people, but they're under a regime that's suppressing. It tells you that America has got to wake up to stopping a communist regime that's intent on taking over America at every level.
The Falun Gong Protection Act will now head to the Senate floor for a future vote. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
A little girl who traveled to over 40 countries with her mom, now a young lady dancing on the world stage. But one thing hasn't changed. For over 20 years, she's been telling the world what the Chinese Communist Party has done to her family during an unprecedented persecution of faith. NTD's Flora Hua has the story.
Fadu is a dancer at New York-based Shen Yun Performing Arts group. Fadu and her mother, Dai Zhizhen, were interviewed by Chinese NTD host Yu Xin.
Dai Zhizhen and Fadu, good to see you again. Fadu, please tell us, why you joined Shen Yun?
The reason I wanted to join Shen Yun is because of my family story. Me and my mom, my whole family, my father and my mom, practice Falun Dafa, and we use truth, compassion, forbearance to measure our daily actions, and we try to be a better person every day. But this belief is not allowed in China.
Fadu's father, Chen Yun, was a Falun Gong practitioner in China. In July 1999, the Chinese Communist Party imposed a ban on this spiritual practice nationwide and started to arrest and detain Falun Gong practitioners. The CCP's top leader at the time, Jiang Zemin, ordered authorities to use national resources and publications to slander and persecute the faith group. Like many other practitioners, Chen went to Beijing to appeal for his freedom of belief. Because he wouldn't give up his faith, Chen was tortured to death in China in 2001 at just 34 years old. At that time, Fadu was a 15-month-old baby. Her mother, Dai Zhizhen, said her hair turned gray overnight because of her enormous grief. Dai faced her sorrow bravely and raised her 1-year-old alone. They traveled to over 40 countries to tell the world about the persecution on Falun Gong. Fadu and her mom won a humanitarian award for their dedication in Australia 18 years ago.
Shen Yun is trying to bring awareness to this persecution, and I think that is a very grand action, and I want to support this action.
How do you benefit from Shen Yun?
Before I joined Shen Yun, I was a very different person. Because I never had a father since I was young, so I was more self-centered and protective of myself. But after I joined Shen Yun, Shen Yun changed me a lot. I learned through studying in Shen Yun, I learned that to achieve something great is not about how well I can do, it's about how well I can support the people beside me, and how just to achieve greatness is done by the entire group, not just about myself. And then I think that I'm very grateful that I can learn such a wonderful value in this group.
Chinese authorities have made many attempts to interfere with Shen Yun performances, even in America. Lawmakers have called for awareness of the CCP's transnational suppression here on the American soil, and for protecting American businesses from China's threats.
Actually, this persecution extends from China to around the world. So if everyone, you have a kind heart, and please help us. Together, we stop this persecution to everyone on this earth. Very important as a mom, yeah.
Fadu says the persecution has destroyed many families inside China. Now she's using her art to give them a voice.
And your last word, Fadu.
The tragedy that happened to my father and my family is not the only case. There are thousands and thousands of cases similar to me. There are also many orphans in China that also are persecuted because of their belief, and simply because they believe in truth, compassion, forbearance, which is different from what the Chinese Communist Party believe. And Shen Yun is trying to bring awareness to this tragedy, and Shen Yun is trying to stop this persecution. I hope all the people watching this program can realize the seriousness of this persecution and how much it is harming innocent people in China. I hope that we can stand together and stop this persecution.
Flora Hua, NTD News.
Could the U.S. be forced into a conflict in the South China Sea? That question hangs in the air as Beijing gets increasingly aggressive toward the Philippines, Washington's treaty ally. If there's a loss of life on Manila's side, will the U.S. come to its defense? Here's an answer from Campbell, the State Department's second highest diplomat.
I think our senior officials have been very clear about what circumstances we would consider that the treaty between the United States and the Philippines would come into play.
His remark comes after recent clashes between China and the Philippines. The Philippines says the Chinese Coast Guard vessels rammed Filipino boats to prevent them from supplying troops stationed on a disputed shoal. A Filipino sailor lost a finger and 7 other sailors were also injured. The U.S. warned last week that it's obligated to defend the Philippines in an armed conflict. The two are treaty allies. Campbell said the U.S. has already had close consultations with the Philippines and taken private steps.
I do think it's important to say, Mike, that the Philippines are very cautious at this juncture. They do not seek a crisis with China. They are seeking dialogue. They're seeking discussion.
He added the U.S. isn't alone in feeling that it's being tested by Beijing.
So the most important thing in this time frame is to be resolute, to be very clear publicly in our support for the Philippines, to draw very clear public and private lines of what we believe is essential for the maintenance of peace and stability.
He also highlighted the increasing coordination between China, Russia, and North Korea. China and North Korea have been supporting Russia's defense industrial base, while Russia and North Korea have upgraded military ties, pledging to provide military assistance if one party is attacked. Campbell said there are limits to these partnerships, but they cannot be ignored.
Before President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump face off this Thursday, a Reuters report says Trump has a proposal to end the Russia-Ukraine war. What's his strategy if he gets elected, and how could it impact U.S.-China relations? We spoke to John Sitilides, former U.S. State Department diplomacy consultant, for his take. John Sitilides, thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you back on the show.
It's great to be with you, Tiffany. Thank you for having me.
Now, Reuters is reporting that if Trump wins in November, he would only supply Ukraine with weapons if there's a peace deal on the table. This is according to two former chiefs of staff in Trump's National Security Council. Trump's spokesperson has said only statements directly from Trump should be considered. But what do you make of this proposal?
And so I think this proposal has been made to former President Trump. It's not his plan, right? It's what former aides have proposed to him, and he has not clearly given a yes or a no, just indicated that there are parts that he likes and parts that maybe he doesn't like. But there's another part to this, of course, Tiffany. One is that he would cut off aid to Ukraine if they did not come to the negotiating table with Vladimir Putin and with Moscow. But the other side of it is he will significantly increase lethal military aid to Ukraine if Putin and Russia do not come to the table. So the idea here is for incentives to both sides to come to the table, negotiate some type of a ceasefire right away, and then see if that opens the pathway to a diplomatic settlement of the Ukraine conflict.
Now, Beijing has been watching what's been happening with Ukraine, especially the international response to it. What would this type of a move mean in terms of how the U.S. counters Beijing's aggression?
We need to look at this as the United States from a strategic interest perspective. And the great debate, the great battle lines that are being drawn in the years and decades to come could potentially play out in the Indo-Pacific region, not only over Taiwan, which has been, of course, the linchpin issue for several years, but even as we've seen in recent weeks and months, very belligerent activity by the People's Liberation Army Navy against the Philippines and against other countries in the South China Sea, international waterways which the People's Republic of China sees as sovereign Chinese waters. It's difficult to see how Xi Jinping understands the U.S. response to date, because there has been significant American and European support for Ukraine, but there really is no clear strategy or way out here. And I think that's probably a puzzling predicament for Beijing to try to determine what the long-term exit strategy might be in the event of a conflict in the Indo-Pacific.
Expanding on that, what would all of this mean in terms of U.S.-China relations going forward?
Well, I think China is already preparing for the potential conflict. We do see a significant hoarding of foodstuffs and fertilizers. We see increasing hoarding of natural gas and oil. So I think that's already baked into the equation, and we see this playing out over the last several years. But much of this really depends on whether or not Xi Jinping is trustworthy and sincere in trying to improve relations with the United States. We know that President Biden and General Secretary Xi last year announced that they would look to produce a thaw in U.S.-China relations. But now we see a report, I think in today's Wall Street Journal, by our U.S. ambassador in Beijing, Nicholas Burns, that the Chinese don't seem at all sincere about trying to improve relations and remain very much dedicated towards a semi-unrestricted warfare type strategy against the U.S. and against the American-led international order.
John Sitilides, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And a new report from Monday, authoritarian regimes like China, North Korea, and Iran have some of the worst human trafficking records in the world. That's according to Washington's newly released report on the crime. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has more from the State Department.
The 2024 Trafficking in Persons report highlights instances of human trafficking in 188 countries. It includes sex trafficking, forced labor, as well as the forcible removal of organs.
A shared belief in the fundamental rights and freedoms of all people. Trafficking violates that shared belief. It also undermines the rule of law. It weakens border security. It limits people's economic opportunity.
13 countries exhibited a policy or pattern of trafficking. Belarus rejoined this list, and Sudan was newly added to the list, while several other governments, including Cuba, the PRC, and Russia, remained on the list from previous years.
The countries placed in the lowest Tier 3 were identified as having significant human trafficking and not working enough to fix it, or even having their officials complicit in these crimes. These countries are subject to sanctions. Those included the authoritarian regimes in China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, among others. Those countries and a few others were said to have a policy or pattern of human trafficking that was state-sanctioned. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects that the report notes are the reports of the Chinese regime's forced live organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience like Falun Gong practitioners, Uyghurs, and others. China also uses human trafficking in its Belt and Road Initiative, which builds infrastructure projects in third world countries to gain military and economic dominance in those countries.
We are also concerned about the treatment of PRC nationals in the Belt and Road Initiatives. That specific program has been, you will see that it's brought up in 16 of our country narratives. We are suggesting that any countries participating in the BRI initiatives really engage in increased oversight and screening.
The report also points to the growing role of technology used to facilitate human trafficking. Perpetrators use social media and other online platforms to recruit victims. But technology such as this has been used by law enforcement to locate perpetrators of human trafficking. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
That's all for today's China in Focus on YouTube. We're now sharing a shortened version of our program here after being demonetized for 3 years. If you'd like to support us, consider donating. Find us at donorbox.org/China-in-Focus or subscribe to our partner platform Epic TV, where you can watch our full episodes. Just click the link down below. Here's what to look out for in our second half. Canada following in the U.S. and Europe's footsteps for planned tariffs targeting Chinese-made electric cars. Still, Ottawa is treading carefully on how to deal with its second largest trading partner. And activists in Hong Kong are making a last chance request, asking a court to reduce their sentences. The case marks the largest targeting pro-democracy supporters since Beijing imposed its national security law on the city. That and more in just a minute here on China in Focus. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you tomorrow.